So get us started. We're going to look at just quickly my background. I am a certified ICP, ACC. I also have my Kanban Management Professional 1 and 2. Yeah, lots of great certifications. But when I went through my Kanban Management Professionals training, that's when I realized that a lot of the things I understood about Kanban were myths. And it wasn't probably until about day 2 of the course that I realized that there was a lot of great things that I could do if I just paid better attention in class and I let those myths go. So that's why this presentation came about, was actually from some of the things that I had heard, some of the things asked about me as an Agile coach along the way. And I just want to share those with you today. Just so you know, I do avidly practice Scrum and Kanban with my family. I get in trouble a little bit sometimes with my kids about that, but I am that passionate about using both and using them interchangeably. So we're going to start with our very first myth. Kanban is a process improvement tool, not a workflow method. So let's talk about what Kanban actually is. So it is a Japanese word and it means signboard. Sorry, I had to make things a little bit bigger for me. And there are 3 components that you can see on every board. You're going to have a visual board that represents the workflow. You're going to be pulling all of those work cards through the system. So not a push system, but a pull system. And you're going to work and set those work in progress limits on every single state of your board. The goal is actually to identify bottlenecks in the process and to fix them so work can flow through as quickly as possible. So the name of the game is speed and getting rid of those bottlenecks. There are an entire set of principles for Kanban. So similar to Agile, you actually have them. They're collaboration, balance, transparency, flow, customer focus. You can read them all. They also have practices as well. So in Kanban, you're going to be focusing on your principles and your practices. And these practices are really what the underpinning of your Kanban board or your Kanban workflow is going to follow. So you're going to be visualizing. You need to make sure you know your work, your workflow, and any risks that you could encounter. You're limiting that work in progress, because when we limit our work in progress, we can actually get work through the system at a particular speed, which goes with managing the flow. So when we're paying attention to that work in progress, we can make sure that we're working at the right flow and making sure that everybody takes work as they're available. We're not spending too much time in our lead time because we're able to kick off and work things as they come up. We're going to talk a little bit later about more of these making policies explicit, but you're understanding the rules that it takes to get from one step in your process to the next step in your process. And it becomes a very important practice to get right. So think about these as miniature definition of dones between each one of the columns on your Kanban board or your flow practice. Seeing a couple things on here. So keep adding stuff and I'll keep sharing everything with you all, don't worry. We're also going to be looking at feedback loops, right? Like that's the whole essence of being agile, and making sure that we're paying attention and reviewing our processes and getting those bottlenecks taken care of, figuring out ways that we can improve, because we want to get things through the process as quickly as possible and out to the customers. You're also going to be using those feedback loops to improve and evolve. So important that we continuously learn and we continuously improve our process. We'll talk in a little bit about some of those practices that we're going to improve upon as well. So for our very first myth on Kanban is a process improvement tool and not a workflow method, it's busted, because we spend just as much time on workflow and improving our workflow as we could ever do on process improvement. Second myth. Kanban is strict, rigid, and doesn't allow any breathing room. Well, one of my most favorite things about this process is it's up to you on your workflow. So it is incredibly flexible. It can be simple or it could be complex, but it's dependent on your process. If you find your board is incredibly complex, guess whose fault it is? The process fault. So we've got to figure out, do we want to change that process up to make it more simple so we have a simpler board, or is it really as complex as it needs to be and we just have to get over that fact? So Kanban being strict, it's not very strict, it's not very rigid, it's completely applicable to your workflow as you'd like it. I mentioned a few minutes ago that we're going to talk about some of those explicit policies that you have as one of the practices. Explicit policies are how you get a card from one column to the next on your board, or one step of your workflow to the next if you're not using a board. It's very important that these rules are stated and everybody understands what it takes. It's like a miniature definition of done to get it from one status to the next. So you might have one for backlog. So how does it move from backlog to the in progress column on the board? And it might actually flow backwards sometimes. For example, if you're doing testing and you work on something in the testing phase and you find out that what was developed was incorrect, it might have to go backwards to in progress. So we're looking at forward momentum and what it takes to move it forward, but we're also setting those policies if something moves back or if something goes into a wait state. So making sure that we are flowing as we can and then adjusting those rules as needed. So the rule isn't technically rigid unless the team sets it as rigid. So it's not Kanban that's to blame. It goes back to your process and your workflow being the actual blame. As a group, got to decide, do we want to keep it complex? Do we want to make it that rigid? Or do we want to change things up a little bit? So for our second myth, being strict and rigid, nope, busted. All right, 3. So this one's probably the one that gets me in the gut the most. Kanban is not real agile. The WIP limits remove for flexibility and the ability to respond quickly. It's actually the opposite. WIP limits create the ability for us to move, to pivot, to adapt, to respond quickly. One of the best things that you can do on your Kanban board is start looking at ways that you can do these class of service swim lanes. So if these are new concepts to you, don't worry. You can get all this on the Kanban University website, but the purpose of having class of service swim lanes is so you can adjust your Kanban board and help with items that have different deliverance cadences. So for those of you doing Scrum, sometimes you get something that's like a hot fix and you have to turn it around immediately and get it out the door. Well, in Kanban, those go into a swim lane called expedited. And those are specific items that we as a group agree have to go immediately. So we're going to add that to our board as its own swim lane, and then we can make sure that we deliver the expedited item as quickly as possible. And since it has its own lane, we remember it because we can see it. Standards, as soon as group we get this done, it gets delivered and it goes to the next environment. Fixed state are for those of you who like to do Scrum. You can actually use a swim lane and put something that's deliverable every 2 weeks and keep that Scrum cadence going without having to interrupt your Kanban board and deliver everything on a 2-week cadence. So by putting these class of service swim lanes in, you can actually adjust your delivery cadence for your groups. I will agree, this can get quite confusing, right? Because you've got to figure out how are you going to verify these. If you have a physical board, really easy because you just put painter's tape up. And then when you're taping your cards up, you make sure you put them in the right swim lane. When you're on electronic tool, it might be a little bit harder to create these. Luckily, the tools that we use at my company, we have flags. So we can use some flags to actually show if we're doing something through the expedited, standard, or fixed state swim lane. We can also use in ours the actual due date on what we expect for the fixed state and for the expedited items. Everything else is considered to be standard and just delivered when it's ready. The last one on class of service swim lanes, though, is called intangibles. And I love this one. This is for all that work the technical group needs to do. And those are expected to be important, maybe not as important as delivering to the customer, but definitely important enough that we need to get them worked and delivered as soon as we can. And we set this one so we can just kind of shine a spotlight on work that the team is doing together. This could be where your NFRs go, those non-functional requirements. You can also put anything on the technical backlog or anything that you need in the way of tech debt that needs to be fixed by the team. And those just get delivered as soon as they are possible. So it might be that you're delivering that within a day or two. It might be something that you're working on for weeks because maybe you're cleaning up something on the back end or you're re-indexing or something. But those you can separate and you can shine the spotlight on and you can make sure they're being worked on as well with your teams. So when you have your boards and you set these swim lanes in, it helps you because you can see when things need to be delivered. But you also have to keep in mind those WIP limits because the WIP limits don't just apply to the columns like your in progress, your testing, your validation. It actually applies as well to each of your swim lanes. So the sum of all the swim lanes should be equal to the sum of the WIP for all of your states. You don't want to go too high on that first one that's expedited. We usually ask to do a 1 because you're trying to get that one out the door as quickly as possible. And you don't want to come to a screeching halt for the rest of the types of items you're trying to do. So in order to free up your WIP for the rest of the team to work on other items, you probably want to keep that expedited pretty darn small. We usually suggest a 1. And this just helps you get your flow on your different items through. I don't know how some of you do this with your teams, but we actually have different cadences. So sometimes our teams that are working on Kanban boards are actually delivering to sprint scrum teams. So they have to have things on an every 2-week cadence. So it just helps us have our board split like this, where we can have those swim lanes to kind of keep an eye on those items that have 2 weeks to completion, some that might have to be turned around immediately, and some that might be able to go to a different environment as soon as they're complete. And by putting that WIP in, you're looking at improving your flow. And why I love WIP is that WIP helps us know if we're doing things at the right pace. Sometimes we don't notice which column is our bottleneck. We might think a card based on the cycle time is just taking too long when we're not sure why. But if we look at our WIP limit in each of our columns, or how long something stayed in each one of those columns, we can find out what's the problem. What's something we weren't sure was a problem to begin with. I tell a story with my groups that I had a development team one time, and they were getting their items through, but they were taking about 11 days in their sprint scrum team. So we decided to do this Kanban method instead in that 2-week time frame, and look at every single state something went through and figure out how much time it is. Where's our bottlenecks? What are the problems that we might have? Why is our flow not correct? And what we found was we did all the work on time, but our code reviews were taking on average usually 24 to 48 hours longer than we had expected. We thought code reviews would be done almost the next day. We hadn't allocated that much time in our estimates. And what we were finding is that other priority work came in and kept bumping the priority of those code reviews further and further down the line, till it would be about 2 or 3 days worth of daily stand-ups that people hadn't done them before we finally jumped on them and made them a priority. So just adding the WIP columns for each of yours will keep you from overflowing one particular state. It'll also help you realize like exactly where are we having those bottlenecks today and what can we do to increase our flow. So if your WIP is too low, you'll have people sitting around and they'll be idle. They won't have enough stuff to work on because our WIP's set so low that we've got everybody swarming around what they've got and half the team's just sitting there. But when it's too low, you're also not getting very many items out. So keep that in mind. If it's too high, you'll see a ton of work just sitting in the doing column and nothing appearing to get done. Why? Because everybody's working on their own stuff and waiting on other people. And then when it's just right, you'll see that you might feel that there's some people that are idle, but you can actually find what people are doing as they go through the process, and they're actually able to answer questions or do that code review or take that extra time for the step to help somebody else out. So those are going to be the 3 measurements you're going to be looking for on your WIP to see if it improves flow. So is it agile? Yes. It does require you to get flexible, respond, pivot very quickly. You've also got the principles and practices that fit pretty closely to the agile principles and values. So I would say that this is real agile. For our 4th one, Kanban can be used only for linear processes or in support teams. I got news for you. Kanban can be used anywhere, and I'm about to give you some examples of it being used outside of development teams. Kanban, one of the best examples given to us during class, is it's used at the Imperial Garden or Palace East Gardens in Tokyo, Japan. The way they use Kanban is when you come up to the gardens, you're given a ticket. Your ticket allows you entrance into the park, and they only give tickets to the people until the tickets run out. Once the tickets run out, they don't let anybody in until a ticket's returned at the other end of the garden. So as somebody goes through, they let them wander the gardens as they'd like, When they're done, they hand their ticket over and then the next person can come through. And that's to maximize the amount of time and space each person gets inside the gardens. Otherwise, gardens would be overcrowded or maybe even trampled because there'd be too many people in a small area. So that is definitely not a linear process. It's basically a process where we are deciding that it's more important to experience the world than to get as many people through as fast as possible. But there's other ways. So Kanban mindset is where it becomes very important. We're using our mindsets to get us to anything that has a to do and a done. So if there's any process in the world that you can think of that has a start and an end point, you can add a Kanban mindset to them and try to figure out where those bottlenecks are to improve flow. A few real life examples. My favorite, traffic. I don't know who on the call has major traffic where they're at, but I'm in Dallas and it's usually a nightmare. And we use traffic lights to stop and start the flow of traffic. We actually, sorry, in my town, we actually decided to increase the flow for buses to get people to actually use the DART system. So Dallas Area Rapid Transit in Plano, Texas, they decided to switch all the lights to match the bus schedule. So as a bus approaches a light, the light turns green based on what time the bus is expected to be there. And this helps people who take the bus system get to work faster than those that are in cars behind the bus, like me, that get the red light. So it's one way that you can improve flow in your area by looking at the traffic patterns and adjusting lights and timing. And we might not agree with them all the time. We might get stuck by some of those red lights, but traffic lights are a great way that we use Kanban in practical applications in the rest of the world. Another good one is morning routines with kids. How many of you have to get kids ready in the morning? Well, set them up a Kanban board, give them a to-do and a done, and let them move their chores from one to the other and see how fast they can get through everything when they can see exactly what's expected out of them and they can see the two options, which is I'm going to be doing it and I'm going to be done with it. Recipes are the same way. You start those. If you are a cook, I don't know if there's anybody that cooks on the call, but I cook a lot and I always make sure that I have everything ready to go before I start that very first step. So I can just flow through my entire process. I've got everything ahead of time. So for those of you who have a lot of experience with Kanban, you would call that the upstream Kanban. That's my design phase. It's me getting all of my ingredients ready to go. And then so I can move all the way through the rest of the steps and take the amount of time that's expected for each step. I've already got my pieces in place. It really does help you bake faster than having to go get flour in the very middle of your actual doing something. Or like me, if you sometimes run out of butter and if you were halfway through the recipe, you might actually end up ruining your pie crust. So very important that when we're following recipes, we're keeping that Kanban mindset in place. And the last one I have for here is kind of goes back to that traffic one, and that's when you have a reroute. So if you use a traffic pattern like Waze or any application like that, you actually get rerouted sometimes because there's a better flow in a different area than what was expected. So it's like a mini little pivot that we're going to take, because if we take it, we save time. And those are just little applications of Kanban actually in the real world and where that Kanban mindset can really play and help you out well. So Kanban being used for a linear process or only in support teams? Nope, busted. I see some great questions coming in, by the way, so don't worry. I'll get to those in a moment. Myth number 5, Kanban is easier. It has no meetings or ceremonies. I think I felt this one really hard before I went to class. Those of you who have been in a Kanban class or been taught by a formal coach probably are laughing at me right now, but I wasn't. I have a huge Scrum background. Mike Cohn was my teacher. So I actually came into it thinking that Kanban had no ceremonies. It was even easier. I didn't have to do anything but a daily stand up with my teams and walk the board. How easy could that be? Well, imagine my surprise when I went to class and I found out that there are 7 ceremonies. One of those is a daily Scrum, but there's 7 ceremonies total, and all have their own cadence, all have their own expectations, and there's actually a rigid way that you get information like actually into the ceremonies, and then you get changes on other ceremonies based on the information. It's crazy. It's a lot more intense on the ceremonies even than Scrum is, but I love it for that reason, and I'm going to show you why. So here are the ceremonies. Part of the ceremonies are stuck on building the right thing. So that's a strategy review and a replenishment meeting. Replenishment, similar to how we call a refinement session in Scrum, for those of you who are Scrum. Build the thing right. That's going to be our operations review, our service delivery review, and our risk review. So several different types of reviews go into building the thing right. And then probably for Scrum Masters out there, build it fast. So when we're talking about building it fast, we go back to that refinement / replenishment meeting, the stand-up that everybody's used to having, and a delivery planning meeting. So yes, even a planning meeting for that delivery, because you might be delivering immediately, but some of those items might be chunked up to be delivered in a 2-week or maybe even a semi-annual cadence or a quarterly meeting. Those are the type of planning reviews or planning meetings that you're going to have. So that's 7. They all have their own cadence. So some of them are quarterly, some of them are monthly, some of them are bi-monthly, some of them are daily. And then you have that delivery planning meeting that's going to be per that delivery cadence. So again, you have all of these on their particular cadence, even though your Kanban board is generally not going to have all the items sticking to a cadence. So these are the items that you would bring to those meetings that you expect to be working on in the next month or the next 2 months, depending on how often that meeting occurs. And as I said before, there is a specific way that information flows from one meeting to another, and how the information in one meeting may change what's happening in another meeting. So for example, on the risk review, you're getting informed by the people who went to the operations review. They're telling you about how many people we've got this month or what we've got that we're delivering, those type of things. But in the risk review, if you have an item that was on the board that you were going to do, but the risk is really high to deliver that item and you don't have the right people in place for it, you might decide to change and not deliver that item or postpone that item. So that change is going to go back to the operations review. So all of these meetings are set up strategically to feed information and change to one another. So for those of us who thought that Kanban is easier because there's no meetings or ceremonies, not true. It's actually busted. And we have 8 of these total, in case you were wondering. So I see some great questions in there. I can't wait to tell you all about that. All right, and then no one estimates in Kanban. Estimates are useless. How many people have heard that one? I've heard that one a lot. The truth is, there actually can be estimates in Kanban. They can be used just as easily as doing an estimate in Scrum. In fact, I would say they're almost easier because in Kanban, you don't really get your hand slapped if you're estimating based on how many days you think someone's going to take more than effort. So we get to let our teams actually go by days, which they would prefer sometimes to do, I think, than trying to go with estimates on effort. So for example, I have a card up here, and this is just a traditional Kanban card. It has a number for the incident. It's got a title. And then as a team, we decide for each of our 3 columns, which in this case is only design, develop, and test, how much time we think it's going to spend in that particular phase. So design here might be just requirements gathering. So we might have to do a little bit of work. We might have to look at the back end, see how it works today, how it might work tomorrow. As a team, figure out how we're going to develop it. So as a group, we might say that it takes us 1 day of effort. So we put one little circle on our card, and then we know exactly how many days we expect it to stay in that particular column on our board. For development, we might say that we calculated it and it's going to take 2 days. So it's got all the little bubbles. So we've got 6 on there. And then for test, we've got 1 bubble, which would equal to about a day effort, because with Kanban, we have to keep in mind that we want to make sure our boards are getting reset every day. So something that's completed in design might not have a developer ready for develop the next day. If something's in develop, it might not have somebody available for test next day. So we're just going to call those full days, even though they're partial day. So when you estimate, you're looking at time, and the team can figure out how much time it thinks it's going to take in each one of those particular columns. And then you can look at what the total would be. So here, the estimate total, if we count up our little bubbles, is 8, which our key is that there's 2 bubbles for a day. So it ends up being 4 days total of effort. And that works out perfect for the group because we're hoping that we're going to be able to complete this within 4 days. Now, the joy of estimating and something this small is that tomorrow when we come in, if we didn't get the design done, we know that we're already 1 day behind. So we know it's going to take us another day to get it complete. And we can guesstimate it's going to take us 5 days from now because we haven't kicked it off. So it helps us with the estimation, in my opinion, by doing it this way. And if you have an electronic tool, not a problem. So we do this at work, and we still use that estimate field that we would have for our Scrum cards, and we actually put in what we think those effort or story points are. And again, on this screen, I'm talking about estimating it based on how long we're going to stay per field. You could just as easily do your story points if your team's more comfortable coming up with those particular numbers. The reason I'm not a big fan of doing the story points when we're talking about Kanban is the name of the game is flow, and we really want to maximize how quickly we are able to move through things, more so than how much effort it takes to do something. So we're looking at, are we right on how long it took versus are we right on how much effort it took? So for the fact that no one uses estimates in Kanban and estimates are useless, it's busted. We do need estimates, and we can use them for forecasting or for forecasting just like we could when we were looking at them for Scrum. Which brings us to the important metric one. There's no capacity or velocity in Kanban, so no forecasting. Well, I just kind of blew that one out of the water with talking about how we can use estimates. So the good thing about Kanban is because you know your WIP limits and you know how many people you have available for your capacity, so you're still looking in on how many people are going to be there this week, for example, you can actually come up pretty easily with an idea of how long it takes to do each card that you've got sitting in your first column. Velocity is actually just the amount of cards completed over a given time period. So you can count those. If you have a tool, all you're doing is you're setting your start date and your end date, and you're counting how many cards were completed during that time, or how many were started and completed if you're looking at your cycle time. So the good thing about the electronic tools is you don't have to go and pull everything off the board and start counting it or keep an extra stack of things so you know exactly how many have gone per week. You can pull it straight out of the machine like this one. These two examples right here are. And we can use these now to forecast a date of completion. We can also use them to forecast how long it normally takes us to the point of from card in the backlog to the end of our development. So when we get it done, and we can just do that, and then we can forecast and we can complete different items. It's not as complicated as some people seem to think it is. The other metrics that are used in Kanban, there's a cumulative flow. And this is a diagram I wish as a Scrum Master we had spent more time on. Cumulative flow is fantastic in helping you diagnose where a team might be having struggles. You can look at a cumulative flow and you look at those bands. If those bands aren't increasing or if they're not about the same width apart, like if the blue was pinched in and the red was expanded out, those tell you there's a problem going on. So you can actually see what it is and diagnose it just by looking at the cumulative flow. And you can see like maybe we were down a couple testers, so our testing band got really big and exploded one time, or maybe we had some development and QA that partnered up at the beginning of a sprint. So our bands went super far down because everybody was able to get their job done without waiting till the end of the sprint to start on them. So just as a Scrum Master or anybody who's working with teams, cumulative flow tells you a lot about the health of the group right now and how their backlog is going. I highly recommend doing some investigation work, checking out how those bands are for the different statuses. You really want them to be about even with each other. And if they're not, start looking into that particular status and find out what's going on. Why is it thinner? Why is it thicker? And that can help you see what's going on with your team. We use that a lot in Kanban. The other one is called the lead time distribution chart. And this one, I'm still iffy on how wonderful this is. So what you do is you make a dot and you count up how many times a story goes a certain amount of days, or how many times a card's on a board and how long it takes. And you're going to be looking at what's the most often time that we have a specific number. The reason I don't find this one as important for me, but I think it's important for others, is that if your teams are having a problem with things carrying over or taking longer than expected, you would notice it because you would have that giant hump like you see right here on the fives. But you also want to look at those ones that are trailing after it. Like, what are those ones that are taking us? Like, how often do we have something that takes us 2 weeks to get done, the 15? How long do we have something that took us a month to get done? Let's look at those and let's figure out how could we have done it differently? How could we do better with this? And those we can start using ways that we can improve upon it. You can also look and see what the average story size is. So maybe we take it all the way back to when we're doing our backlog and we're splitting it down even further. So these both can kind of help as a coach or as a scrum master or as a lead to kind of go back into the team and see where can we really improve on our processes. Is it status related, or is it size of story and how long it takes us to deliver something? So these both can be great to be used, but again, they're after the fact, which is why I'm not as a big of a fan of either one of these, because we're looking at what we've done in the history. We're not looking at how we're going to be going forward. So use these, bring them to retrospectives. That's where you're going to be talking about them. So no capacity or velocity in Kanban? Not true. We can do capacity and velocity in Kanban. And because of that, we can forecast. And the last myth we'll talk about is Kanban is easy to master and implement. Well, I hope if there's nothing else I leave you with today, it's that Kanban can get pretty complex because our workflows are often complex. And that's why it's not as easy to master and implement. It's not the grass is greener from doing our Scrum practice. It's actually going to just as easily as Agile, it's going to shine that spotlight on all the problems we as a team are dealing with and what we need to be working on. So not very easy to implement, but fantastic as a great workflow improvement tool for any team. I would recommend this for teams specifically that are trying to deliver quicker than their cadence allows, or teams that are struggling because they're trying to deal with a lot of changes that happen. They have some work that can be delivered on a 2-week cadence, but they might have some work that needs to be turned around immediately. Once you have those different variances on when things need to be delivered, Kanban actually might be a less stressful way for your team to implement having that cadence of every 2 weeks, but also being able to turn things around on a given time period, like a day or two. So you'll have to go through and figure out your workflow first. That's the first step of Kanban. And that's usually where we see the most complexity and dependencies that are fleshed out. That's where we look at what are the different steps our team goes through, what's on our definition of done, what are the steps that we all do and we agree have to be done every time. Those are basically going to become our columns within our Kanban board, which shows you how complex your process might be. Then as a team, you might have to do those, you have to put in those explicit policies. So you might have to decide that maybe some of those columns need to start being put together and maybe we don't need those extra steps. Maybe we should be doing it all as one particular chunk and we're going to do it by putting an explicit policy and say in progress means an item is this. And when it goes to testing, it will be ready to do this. And then Kanban being easy. I saw some of this come up in the questions, so I'm hoping that this one's going to answer some of this for you. But it requires your team to focus on finishing work on the board. You're not spending as much time in backlog grooming or refinement and trying to groom stories because you can't kick off a story until a story's completed or a card's completed. So what you're going to do is you as a team are going to agree that getting things completed matters more than the stuff that's not on the board yet. Kind of hard to do because sometimes product owners really want us to focus on what's coming up next and look at breaking those down into smaller pieces. But what I like about Kanban is we're trying to finish work instead of just starting a bunch of work. So we're going to focus on finishing it and we'll come to the product owner and we're ready for the next group of items. And the product owner, you're going to continuously refine and get that priority right because you never know when a team is going to come to you and say, we're ready for more work. They're going to be completing work and then they're going to come to you and they're going to say, I need something now, and you're going to have to be ready to go. So product owners are continuously refining what's in that backlog queue. You're going to make sure that it's ready to go, that that top item is priority, that it matters more than anything else in the queue, and that it's a small enough chunk that you can give it to the team and the team can decide if it needs to be broken down further. But for the most part, it's ready for the team to take and run and move it to the next column and the next column and the next column. Again, you can set that through an explicit policy if you're struggling with how small things need to be or about how much work. We have team leads often that jump in and help out really quick with the product owner and kind of make sure that it's about the right size for what they think the team can handle. So it's just important as a team, we're constantly communicating about that. But we're going to make sure that those shifting priorities matter too. So if the product owner gets this little item that slides in third place and it becomes more important, then the team's not married to those first two, where now they're all disjointed because they thought they were working on the next two and they're really working on something brand new brought to the team. So we're going to take that time we would normally be spending in our refinement and we're going to use it for replenishment instead. So when the team's ready for more work, that's when we're going to go and start pulling instead of looking too far ahead. And that's why it's not as easy. So we're busted on that one. And I've got a lot of questions, which was the next slide. So I kind of want to scroll back up here and start getting some of these questions. If anybody wants to come off mute ahead of time, though, feel free.
So we have a, sorry, there is, I think, the Daniel, I think he posted, is there some semi-official guide you can link to that your Kanban is based on?
I sure can. It is the Kanban University, so we'll make sure that we have a link going in there for that one. Not a problem. And you will get the notebook and you will get the recording, I believe, after this, correct?
Yep.
Hi, Christina. My name is Arshad Hussain. First of all, very, very nice presentation. Thank you so much for that. All right. I have put down many questions in it. I apologize in advance. Just to let you know, I'm just trying to get some clarification in Kanban. I do use it on regular basis. Amazing tool and very good concept, but again, I'm still a learner in that sense. So please don't mind all my questions. And if you don't mind from top to bottom, it's your take. Go ahead, please.
Sure. So the first one I saw was, please provide an example of how to make the process better so Kanban flow is optional or is optimal. Sorry. Are you looking for a specific example on a development process or?
Not a development process per se, but in your first couple initial slides, you were mentioning about, creating a flow that's really optimal. And I was just wondering from that perspective, you also mentioned that it all depends on the organization to organization, how you set up your processes. So when it comes to setting up processes, that's also kind of threw me off. That is there options to pick multiple processes? Are there existing processes as we can select from? Some kind of example that can set us free in that sense, letting us know that, these are the guidelines. I understand these are all frameworks. We can pick and choose, but some kind of example will be helpful.
So I'll give you the coach example or the coach answer, and I'll give you the training answer. So on the coach answer, we would say, what's your current workflow? Let's map it out and let's figure out what your particular Kanban board would be. And then as a team, we're going to figure out what our WIP limits should be. And then as a team, we're going to figure out what the optimal time for an item to go from the beginning to the process to the end of the process is. And as a group, we'll figure it all out together. From the training perspective, I train my teams that their goal is to get their items through their Kanban board on a weekly basis. And the reason I've put such an aggressive timeline on there is we have a very fast changing industry that our Kanban teams work with. And their changes are expected by customers to be almost immediate. And the longest a customer is willing to wait that we've found happy is within the same week. So if they ask me on a Monday and I say I can get it to you next Monday, they jump up and down and they think it's great. If I tell them it'll be 2 weeks, I'm usually in trouble because they want it quicker. And we don't usually take on items that aren't able to be broken down and delivered in that kind of time frame. These are specific teams where their normal items would normally take about 2 to 3 days of time to complete. So I would say with your teams, you want to train them that the goal is, if they're moving from Scrum to Kanban, is that they're going to clear off their Kanban boards quicker than they would have in Scrum. Otherwise, there's no advantage to going from Scrum to Kanban. If your teams are just starting out with Kanban, you have to figure out what the right flow is for the team based on the steps in the process. This might mean that your goal next year is 1 week, and right now you're at 3 weeks because there's so much red tape you have to get through, and there's so many process steps that just have to be weeded out of the process before you could even move forward. But the first step for everybody, regardless, is you have to figure out what your current workflow is, or set what you want your workflow to be. So if you've never done a workflow before, or you've never looked at what your steps are, or your brand new product, then you would have to start with creating one. If you have one right now and there is a process, then you would want to look at how that process goes as a team and diagram it out. So I know that's a lot. Thank goodness for being recorded, because you can go back and listen to all of that. But there's not a one size fits all for the Kanban groups. There's not going to be a one size fits all for all industries. And there's definitely not one even within an industry based on product to product. I would just encourage people to remember, get it done. That's important.
Okay. No, that's excellent answer. Thank you very much. It's just that for my team, they're already overwhelmed with Scrum, right? And telling them to do the same kind of job within 1 week, it's decomposing their work even in smaller pieces in order to make it happen within 1 week. That's a task that we have to come up with an idea. Let's go to the next question, please, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no problem. The next one I saw was, who decides done? That's a great one. Everyone. That's what those explicit policies are, is everybody on the team deciding what is done for the steps and then what is done for the final step. So to get it from one status to the next, you basically do a definition of done on every status. So that done